Hi, my name is Zeta, and I'm a PhD student at ETH Zurich. I'm going to present to you today a work called Divide and Scale, a formalization of distributed ledger sharding protocols. This is a joint work with Lefteris Kokoriskoyas and Roger Badenhofer. The creation of blockchain technology was a revolutionary event. However, the implementation of this technology continues to pose a significant challenge related to efficiency. Throughput, which is the transactions per second, are not high enough to compete against existing systems. Both Bitcoin and Ethereum support tens of transactions per second, while payment providers like Visa can process thousands of transactions per second. For blockchain to support large-scale applications, we need some new technologies. The research community has been researching this issue for a long time, and at the present, there are two major layer expansions that address this issue. Layer 1 and Layer 2. Layer 2, a considerable part of the workload is performed on-chain, and the blockchain is only used to resolve disputes. Examples of Layer 2 are payment channels, sidechains, hubs, and rollups. Layer 1, on the other hand, we're trying to directly increase the transaction processing capacity on the chain. This includes changing the consensus mechanisms using other structures like tags and sharding. In this work, we mainly focus on sharding. Sharding employs parallelizability to address the blockchain issue. The first question we answer is what exactly is sharding? In high level, sharding systems employ multiple blockchains in parallel, which are called the shards. The shards operate under the same consensus. Now, different sets of participants run consensus and validate transactions independently, and this is why and how the system scales. There are various different solutions on how to design a sharding system. In this work, we analyze and evaluate the most prominent of those. All these works claim they can securely shard the blockchain in an efficient manner. But most of these works define what sharding means in a different manner and present performance evaluations in which they show increased transaction throughput compared to other works. However, we observe a lack of common ground. The goal of this work is to define exactly that. So what is sharding in a formal framework that can allow us to determine whether protocols actually achieve sharding in a secure and efficient manner. Using this framework, we can further evaluate their performance and also compare sharding protocols to each other. Before we go to the main part of the paper, we introduce the model. We assume a synchronous model, which means the protocols proceed in rounds. Multiple consecutive rounds define an epoch. We assume the adversary is slowly adaptive, which means that in every epoch the adversary is static, so he cannot change the corruption set, while from epoch to epoch the adversary can change which parties to corrupt. We further assume that the adversary is computationally bounded, which means that the cryptography holds, and last, that the adversary controls f out of n parties. In permissionless settings, this translates to having an adversary that can control a percentage of the computational power, for instance, in proof-of-work systems, or a percentage of the stake in proof-of-stake systems. To define what sharding is, we introduce four properties. We built upon the seminal work of Carey et al., where it was defined what distributed ledger is. So we extend these properties and we try to capsulate what a distributed sharded ledger is. The first property, similarly to traditional blockchains, is persistence, and it is a security property. Persistence states that if a transaction is confirmed by an honest party, then no honest party will ever disagree about the position of this transaction in the ledger. Persistence essentially expresses the agreement between honest parties on the transaction order. In other words, it expresses the finality of transactions if they are included deep enough in the ledger. How deep enough is dependent on this parameter k, which is a security parameter, and depends on the underlying consensus mechanism employed by each shard. In contrast to single blockchains, in sharding, a second security property is required. We term this property consistency, and it states that there is no round in which two different parties confirm two conflicting transactions. Consistency conveys the atomic property of cross-shard transactions. Cross-shard transactions are the transactions that span multiple shards and should either abort or commit in all shards. The third property we require is liveness. Similarly to traditional blockchains, this property encapsulates the desire of the ledger to make progress. Last, but most important, we present the property scalability. Scalability is a performance property at the core of what a sharded system is. Scalability encapsulates the speedup of a sharded blockchain system compared to a non-sharded blockchain system. We require for scalability to hold to have a sharding system that scales in 3 dimensions: bandwidth, computation, and storage. Bandwidth is expressed often through the communication complexity of the subprotocols of the system, and it expresses the average number of messages per party. On the other hand, the computation is counted by calculating the total number of times all the parties perform transaction verification. To capture the computational complexity, we assume the existence of a verification oracle, which can verify a transaction in constant time. We measure then the computational complexity by counting how many times all the parties call the verification oracle. Finally, storage is an important and often neglected component of sharding. With storage overhead, what we do is we calculate how much data the sum of all parties store compared to a single database where the data are only stored once. For instance, in Bitcoin, the storage is linear to the number of nodes, since each node stores the entire blockchain. In a sharding protocol, we require parties to store less than the entire blockchain. Otherwise, the system does not shard properly. Well, it is important to note here that at this point the storage becomes a bottleneck is when the system runs for a long period of time, because then every party that changes shards needs to bootstrap to the new shard history in order to be able to verify the transactions reliable. But we will see more about that later. Overall, what we define as a sharding protocol is a protocol that satisfies persistence, consistency, liveness, and scalability. Further, we define a performance metric, which we term throughput factor. The throughput factor expresses the average number of blocks that can be processed per round by a sharding protocol. The throughput factor depends on 3 variables: how fast the chain grows, what is the quality of the chain, meaning how many honest blocks are created compared to the serial blocks, and third, the degree of parallelism. What we mean by degree of parallelism is how many shards we have and what is the average size of transactions. We essentially need to estimate how many times we run consensus for each valid transaction until it is deep enough in the chain, and then also calculate how many shards we have in the system. All these 3 combined give us the throughput factor. Now let's proceed with the model and introduce some more assumptions before we go to the core of the paper. First, we assume a constant block size, which is in sync with existing blockchains and sharding systems. Second, we assume each transaction has a constant average size, meaning that the number of inputs and outputs are on average a small constant number. This is a reasonable assumption given that in most cases, for instance in Bitcoin, the size of the transaction is approximately 5. Now let's see our first result. Here we prove that no sharding protocol exists that tolerates an adaptive adversary that can corrupt more than n over m parties, where n is the number of the total number of parties and m is the number of shards. To show that, let's go towards contradiction and assume that such a sharding protocol exists. From the pigeonhole principle, we know that there is at least one shard with size n over m. And since the adversary can corrupt more than n over m parties, then he can corrupt the entire shard. In this case, the adversary can double append UTXOs to different shards, which means that the consistency property is broken. To address this issue, we could say that every node verifies cross-shard transactions, but that means that every node needs to download the other shard's blockchain And this has a very high storage overhead, which means that scalability does not hold. To proceed to further results, we need to introduce another assumption, and that is that the UTXO is partitioned uniformly at random in shards. The UTXOs are the transactions, essentially, is the unspent transaction outputs. This assumption is also in sync with the proposed protocols in literature. Consider that in non-randomized processes of creating shards, the adversary can pre-compute and then bias the process in a permissionless system. Hence, all sharding proposals so far employ a random process for shard creation. Furthermore, all shards process also processes approximately the same amount of transactions. Otherwise, the efficiency of the protocol would depend on the shard that processes the most transactions. So we consider for these reasons that this is a reasonable assumption. Under this security model now, we show that there is no sharding protocol that requires participants to be light nodes on the shards involved in cross-shard transactions. This is easy to see because UTXOs are random strings, which means all transactions are cross-shard on expectation, which means that each ledger interacts with all other ledgers. Ledgers are the chains, the shards essentially, which means that all parties must be light nodes to all other shards. Given that we have a constant block size, that means that if all parties are light nodes to every shard, then we cannot scale. We simply compress the information that we hold by a constant factor. Therefore, these protocols do not satisfy scalability. Before we proceed to the final results, we introduce a further assumption. We assume that the parties are assigned to shards uniformly at random. And that is because any other shard assignment strategy yields equivalent or worse guarantees, since we have no knowledge on which parties are malicious. First, we show that any sharding protocol can scale up to n over log n in our security model. To prove that, we first show an upper bound on the number of shards we can have. In order to guarantee honest majority in each of the shards, we need n over log n shards. And in each shard, each node stores at least t over m transactions, where t is the number of transactions in this epoch. So the storage overhead is n, which is the number of parties, times t over t times m, which gives us a storage overhead of log n. That means that we can scale up to n over log n. The second result we have is we show that any sharding protocol must employ verifiable compaction of the state. And that means that we must employ a mechanism that is able to compact the state, compress the information in a verifiable manner. There is a lot of work towards this direction. The simplest way to do so is to employ checkpoints. So every time the epoch changes, we checkpoint by posting the last block the UTXO pool. But there are more sophisticated ways to do so with cryptographic accumulators, zero-knowledge proofs, non-interactive proofs of works, etc. The reason we want this is because we assume a slowly adaptive adversary, which means that we need to periodically reassign parties to shards. That means that every time that a node changes a shard, he needs to bootstrap to the new shard, so download the history, in order to be able to verify the transaction reliably. Now, if all parties download all the shard history, the storage after a polynomial number of epochs will become proportional to the non-sharding protocol. Later, we show that in our work, we show that we evaluate multiple existing sharding systems, and we show two of them, elastic and monoxide, fail to satisfy our properties, while only ledger and rapid chain satisfy all the properties in the permissionless setting, while chain space only in the permission setting. Fortunately, we have no time to go through this evaluation process. We conclude by identifying the 5 essential components of sharding protocols. These are a Sybil resistance mechanism, which we need in a permissionless setting to go to permissioned in epochs, a randomness generation protocol in order to provide unbiasable randomness, and is typically executed at the end of each epoch. The shard consensus, which should adhere to the properties defined by Garay et al., and also allow for light client verification with a sublinear proof. We also identify a critical component which is often ignored, and that is the epoch transition. And this is where we said we need to compact the state. And most importantly, the fifth component is how we partition the state, so the transactions, and how we handle cross-shard transactions. There are multiple ways to do so. Each sharding protocol introduces a new one, and of course, this is the most important part.